December 16, 1944. The frozen forests of Belgium. A young German soldier, barely 19 years old, crouches in his foxhole as American artillery screams overhead. He survived 3 years on the Eastern Front. He knows artillery. He knows when to duck, where to hide, how to read the sound of incoming shells. But this morning, something is different. The shells aren't hitting the ground. They're detonating 30 feet above him, raining steel fragments directly into his foxhole. The tree he's hiding behind offers no protection. The earth beneath him provides no sanctuary. In seconds, he and everyone around him are dead. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that he'd just encountered the most revolutionary weapon of World War II. A weapon so secret that its existence was guarded more closely than the atomic bomb. A weapon that would transform not just this battle, but warfare itself forever. This is the story of the proximity fuse, and it begins with an act of insubordination that would change military history. Colonel Oskar Axelson stares at the radio reports coming from his forward positions near Monschau, Germany. The situation is deteriorating rapidly. His 406th Artillery Group is supporting the 38th Cavalry Squadron, a small reconnaissance unit, and they're being overwhelmed. The German offensive that started just hours ago at 5:30 this morning has achieved complete surprise. 200,000 German soldiers, 1,000 tanks, nearly 2,000 artillery pieces, all hidden in the fog-shrouded Ardennes. Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and recapture Antwerp. And right now, it's working. Axelson knows conventional artillery won't stop this assault. The Germans are advancing in force through the dense forest. Standard shells explode on impact with the ground, and soldiers can take cover, use terrain, survive. But Axelson has another option. Sitting in his ammunition depot are shells fitted with a device so revolutionary, so secret, that he's under strict orders never to use them on ground targets. These are proximity fuses. Miniature radar systems packed into artillery shells that can detect their distance from targets and detonate at the perfect height automatically. He's seen what they do to aircraft. Now he's about to find out what they do to soldiers. At 0600 hours, Colonel Axelson makes a decision that could end his career. He orders his gunners to load the proximity fuse shells. No authorization from higher command, no permission, just a desperate gamble to save American lives. What happens next will be talked about in hushed tones across the entire German army within days. The first salvo leaves the guns with the distinctive shriek of outgoing artillery. German soldiers advancing through the forest hear it coming and react with practiced efficiency. They dive into foxholes, take cover behind trees, press themselves into ditches. They're veterans. They know how to survive artillery. But then the shells detonate, not on the ground, not against trees, 30 feet in the air, directly above them. Each explosion creates a cone of metal fragments traveling at thousands of feet per second, covering an area 50 times larger than a conventional shell. The fragments come from above, from the sides, from angles no soldier has ever had to defend against. Men die in their foxholes, behind trees, in ditches, everywhere they sought shelter. The German attack at Monschau stops cold, not slows down, stops. Within an hour, the 326th Volksgrenadier Division has suffered catastrophic casualties. Survivors are reporting something impossible. American shells that explode by themselves in midair, shells that seem to know exactly where German soldiers are hiding. Some call them Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons. Others whisper that the Americans have made a pact with the devil. The truth is somehow even more extraordinary. Inside each of these shells is a technological miracle. A self-contained radar system no larger than a coffee can, containing 130 electronic components. 4 tiny vacuum tubes, the same kind you'd find in a 1940s radio, but miniaturized and hardened to survive forces that would crush a human body to microscopic thickness. When fired from an artillery piece, these shells experience 20,000 times the force of gravity. 20,000 Gs. For comparison, a fighter pilot blacks out at 9 Gs. These delicate electronics have to function at forces that would liquefy human tissue while spinning at extreme rotational speeds, in temperatures ranging from 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit in the gun barrel to sub-zero at the peak of their trajectory. And they have to work with over 80% reliability, every single time. The science behind this weapon started years earlier in a disguised facility in Silver Spring, Maryland. a building that looked like an abandoned used car dealership but housed one of the most important laboratories in American history. Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. Inside, Dr. Merle Tuve drove a program with Manhattan Project-level intensity and secrecy. At peak production, this laboratory employed 3% of all American physicists, 3%, working on a single weapon system. The security was extraordinary. Workers couldn't discuss their jobs, not even with their spouses. Each fuse carried a unique serial number for tracking. If you tried to take one home, if you talked about what you were doing, if you violated any security protocol, you disappeared into a military prison. Because everyone understood. If the enemy got this technology, the war could be lost. The technical challenges seemed insurmountable. Radio tubes designed for living room entertainment had to be completely redesigned to survive being shot from a cannon. Dr. James Van Allen, who would later discover Earth's radiation belts, created vacuum tubes no larger than pencil erasers that contained all the functionality of conventional radio tubes. The breakthrough in miniaturization techniques pioneered for these fuses would later revolutionize the entire electronics industry. Your smartphone, your laptop, the integrated circuits that power modern life, they all descend from the work done in that disguised laboratory in Silver Spring. But on December 16, 1944, none of that mattered to Colonel Axelson. He was waiting to see if he'd be court-martialed or commended. The answer came faster than he expected. Word of what happened at Monschau spreads through the American command structure like wildfire. General Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, receives the reports and immediately grasps the implications. The German offensive is the most dangerous moment for Allied forces since D-Day. Every advantage matters. On December 19th, just 3 days after Axelson's unauthorized use, Eisenhower formally requests permission to deploy proximity fuses across the entire battlefield. By December 21st, all restrictions are lifted. The most closely guarded secret in the Allied arsenal, a weapon that cost $1 billion to develop, second only to the atomic bomb, is released for general combat use. And the killing begins in earnest. American logistics swing into action with the efficiency that defines their entire war effort. Within days, proximity-fused shells are being delivered to artillery units throughout the Ardennes. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion at Bastogne receives their allocation just as the German ring closes around the town. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion, equipped with M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers, begins using them to defend the northwestern approaches. The 969th Artillery Battalion, an African-American unit commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Barnes, employs them with devastating effect southwest of Bastogne. And every unit discovers the same terrifying truth. Artillery has just been transformed from a support weapon into a tool of mass destruction. Let me explain what this means in practical terms. Before proximity fuses, artillery was an art form. You needed forward observers who could see the target, who could call in corrections. Adjust left 200, add 50 yards, fire for effect. It took time, skill, and luck. The enemy could move, weather could interfere. And even when everything worked perfectly, soldiers who knew their business could survive by taking cover. Not anymore. With proximity fuses, you just aimed in the general direction of enemy forces and fired. The shells would find their own optimal detonation point, no observers needed, no adjustments required, and no defense possible. The Germans are about to learn this lesson in the most devastating way imaginable, at a place that will become synonymous with American determination and German defeat. Bastogne. By December 20th, the 101st Airborne Division is completely surrounded, outnumbered, low on ammunition, cut off from supply. The German commander, Lieutenant General Heinrich von Luttwitz, sends an ultimatum: surrender or be annihilated. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe sends back a one-word response that will become legendary: nuts. The German officers, confused by American slang, ask for clarification. McAuliffe's staff translates, it means go to hell. The Germans promise to show no mercy. They're going to unleash everything they have on the surrounded Americans. What they don't know is that the Americans have already received their proximity fuses, and the mathematics of death are about to be demonstrated with brutal clarity. December 22nd, German infantry advances across snow-covered fields toward Bastogne in traditional assault formations. It's a technique refined over years of combat. spread out enough to avoid concentrated casualties, close enough to maintain unit cohesion, officers in front, veterans steadying the teenage conscripts filling out the ranks. They've done this 100 times before, but they've never done it under proximity-fused artillery fire. The American 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, equipped with 75mm pack howitzers, opens fire. The shells scream overhead, and then silence. No ground impacts, no explosions against trees. Instead, the shells detonate 30 feet above the advancing Germans with precise timing, creating overlapping patterns of destruction that leave no safe zones. Entire platoons disappear, just cease to exist. One moment they're advancing, the next moment there's nothing but bodies and blood in the snow. German prisoners captured later that day report that their units lost cohesion before even reaching American lines. Soldiers simply broke and ran. Some threw down their weapons and surrendered rather than continue forward under that incomprehensible fire. These aren't cowards. These are veterans of the Eastern Front, men who'd fought at Kursk and Stalingrad and survived, but they'd never encountered anything like this. Meanwhile, the all-African-American 969th Artillery Battalion is creating its own hell with 155mm howitzers. The larger shells, detonating at 50 feet, cover even greater areas. The battalion fires continuously, creating a ring of death around Bastonia's perimeter that German forces find absolutely impenetrable. Between December 19th and December 31st, the 463rd alone fires 7,676 rounds. That's not an estimate. That's the exact number from official unit records. While not all are proximity fused due to limited supply, those that are reshape the entire battle. German assault formations simply melt away. The psychological damage is as severe as the physical casualties. German soldiers start refusing orders to attack. Elite SS troops, indoctrinated with beliefs in German superiority, break down crying. The wonder weapons Hitler promised them, the super tanks and jet fighters and miracle bombs, none of them materialized. But the Americans have wonder weapons, and they're using them to systematic industrial effect. But Bastogne is just the beginning, because General George Patton is about to provide the most thoroughly documented demonstration of proximity-fused lethality in the entire war, and the casualty numbers are going to shock even hardened military historians. December 25th. Christmas. Patton's Third Army is driving north to relieve Bastogne, and they're using proximity fuses as a breakthrough weapon. Near the town of Echternach, along the Sauer River, American observers spot a German battalion attempting a night crossing. The river is partially frozen. Darkness and fog provide concealment. It's exactly the kind of situation where traditional artillery struggles. You can't see the target clearly. Adjusting fire takes time. The enemy might complete the crossing or disperse before you achieve effective fire. But Patton's artillery commander, Brigadier General Edward Williams, has developed new tactics specifically for proximity fuse employment. He doesn't need to see the target clearly. He doesn't need to adjust fire. He just needs to know approximately where the Germans are. And then he's going to demonstrate what happens when you have nowhere to run. The artillery opens fire. Proximity fused shells begin detonating over the river crossing. The Germans, caught in the open on the ice, have the Sauer River behind them and American fire in front and above. There is no cover, no escape, no tactical response that can save them. For 15 minutes, shells detonate continuously over the crossing point. Each explosion creates a cone of fragments that sweeps the ice clean of life. When the firing stops, American forces advance to assess the damage. They count the bodies, all of them. 702 German soldiers dead, 702. That's not an estimate, that's an actual count. An entire battalion essentially ceased to exist in 15 minutes. Patton himself witnessed this engagement and recorded it in his memoir, War as I Knew It. Quote, "We caught a German battalion crossing the Sauer. The new Posite ammunition was devastating. The shells burst in the air above them. They had nowhere to run." End quote. 702 men, sons, brothers, fathers, dead in less time than it takes to watch a sitcom episode. The German soldiers who survived, and there weren't many, spread the word. Don't cross rivers when Americans are watching. Don't move in the open. Don't gather in groups. Don't do anything that might attract American artillery. Because if they decide to fire on you with their devil shells, you're already dead. You just don't know it yet. But the terror of proximity fuses isn't limited to open ground. In the dense forests of the Ardennes, they're about to become even more lethal. Because the trees themselves are about to become weapons. Traditional artillery in forests is actually less effective than in open ground. Shells hit trees and detonate prematurely. Trunks and branches provide cover. Dense vegetation absorbs fragments. Soldiers trained in forest fighting know how to use terrain, how to minimize casualties. But proximity fuses transform forests into kill zones in ways that defy every lesson learned in military history. Here's why. When a proximity-fused shell detonates 30 feet above the forest canopy, it does two things simultaneously. First, it releases its own lethal fragments, traveling at thousands of feet per second. Second, it shatters tree branches, creating thousands of additional projectiles, wooden splinters, some as long as a man's arm, traveling at hundreds of feet per second, metal from above, wood from the sides, death from every direction, taking cover behind trees. The tree explodes and kills you with splinters. Digging a foxhole, the fragments come from above. Spreading out to avoid concentrated casualties, the wide area effects find you anyway. Bunching together for mutual support, an entire squad dies together. There is no correct tactical response. German units trained in forest warfare, veterans who'd survived years in the deadly forests of the Eastern Front, find their expertise worthless. American artillery units quickly learn that a single proximity-fused 155mm shell, detonating above the forest canopy, can clear an area the size of a tennis court of all living things. One shell, one tennis court, all dead. The combination of metal and wood creates a 360-degree kill zone that extends from the treetops to the forest floor. You cannot evade it. You cannot armor against it. You cannot survive it through skill or experience or luck. The Germans give it a name. Baumsprenger, tree burster. And it becomes the thing that German soldiers fear more than any other weapon in the American arsenal, more than tanks, more than aircraft, more than the dreaded American infantry with their overwhelming firepower, because those things you could fight, those things you had a chance against. But the tree bursters? They were death itself, delivered with mechanical precision. Now, while German soldiers are dying by the thousands in the Ardennes, their high command is making one of the most catastrophic intelligence failures of the entire war. A failure that will cost them any chance of developing countermeasures. Because the Germans actually capture proximity fuses, lots of them. And then they make a decision that will be studied in military academies for decades as an example of institutional blindness. In late December 1944, advancing German forces overrun an American ammunition depot. Inside, they find approximately 20,000 proximity fuse shells. 20,000. This should be an intelligence windfall of historic proportions. You've captured the enemy's most secret weapon in massive quantities. You rush them to your best engineers for analysis. You reverse engineer them. You develop countermeasures. You start your own production. This is Intelligence 101. But that's not what happens. German technical experts examine the captured fuses and reach a conclusion that will doom their army to continued slaughter. They declare the fuses impossible. Here's their reasoning. The fuses contain vacuum tubes, delicate glass tubes filled with wire filaments, the same tubes used in radios. But artillery shells experience forces that should shatter those tubes instantly. 20,000 Gs of acceleration, spinning at extreme speeds, temperature extremes from 3,000 degrees to far below zero. It's impossible that vacuum tubes could survive these conditions. Therefore, the Germans conclude the visible vacuum tubes must be decoys. The real mechanism must be something else. Magnetic detection, perhaps, or some form of capacitance switch, but definitely not vacuum tubes, because that's physically impossible. This conclusion stems from a bitter irony. Germany had actually led proximity fuse development before the war. Companies like Rheinmetall Borsig and AEG Berlin had working prototypes by 1940. German electrostatic proximity fuses showed 95% reliability in testing. But then Hitler issued his infamous order: cancel all weapons projects requiring more than 6 months to reach production. Germany needed immediate results, not future capabilities. So the proximity fuse program was terminated. The engineers were reassigned. The prototypes were shelved. And now, in December 1944, those same engineers couldn't believe that the Americans had solved problems Germany had abandoned. It was a failure of imagination that would cost tens of thousands of German lives. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, would later admit during interrogation that German proximity fuses were 3 to 4 months from production when the war ended. 3 to 4 months. If Hitler hadn't canceled the program, if German engineers had continued development, if they'd fielded proximity fuses in 1941 or 1942, the entire war might have unfolded differently. But they didn't. And now German soldiers are paying the price for that decision with their lives. Meanwhile, American industry is producing these impossible devices at a rate that stuns even American commanders. 40,000 proximity fuses per day, every single day. Over 100 companies are involved in production. The Crosley Corporation abandons refrigerator manufacturing to make fuses. Emerson Radio Retool from Home Electronics, RCA, General Electric, Sylvania, all converting their facilities to weapons production. The workforce is predominantly women, working 12-hour shifts 6 days a week, maintaining precision that would be remarkable in peacetime and is absolutely extraordinary during wartime. They can't know what they're making. Security compartmentalization means each worker sees only their small part of the assembly. But they know it's vital. They know it's saving American lives. And they produce one proximity fuse every 2 seconds, around the clock, day after day, week after week. The cost efficiency achieved is remarkable. In 1942, each fuse cost $732, more than a worker's annual salary. By December 1944, mass production has driven the cost to $18 per unit. That's a 97% cost reduction while improving quality and reliability. This is American industrial capitalism operating at peak efficiency, taking a laboratory prototype that costs hundreds of dollars and turning it into a mass-produced item that costs less than a tank of gas. By the end of the war, American factories will produce 22 million proximity fuses. 22 million. During the Battle of the Bulge alone, 200,000 are fired, each one increasing artillery lethality by a factor of 5 to 10. Each one causing German soldiers to question whether they can survive the next 5 minutes, and General George Patton understands their value better than perhaps any commander in the theater. He's about to use them to break open the German defenses and relieve Bastogne. And his employment of proximity fuses will be so effective that post-war analysts will call them the deciding factor in the entire Battle of the Bulge. Patton's Third Army turns north on December 22nd, driving through terrible weather toward Bastogne. His artillery commander, Brigadier General Edward Williams, pioneers a new tactic called time-on-target concentration using proximity fuses. Here's how it works. Multiple artillery battalions, sometimes dozens of guns spread across miles of front, all fire simultaneously. The shells are calculated to arrive at the target at exactly the same moment. When they do, when dozens of proximity fused shells detonate simultaneously at optimal height over the same location, the effect is apocalyptic. German soldiers who experience this and survive, and there aren't many, call it the bell toll of death. Because there's a moment of silence as all the shells reach their apex, a moment where the world seems to hold its breath. And then every shell detonates at once. The sound, they say, is like a giant bell tolling, and if you hear it, if you're underneath when it happens, you're already dead. Between December 22nd and December 29th, in just 1 week, Patton's Third Army fires 50,000 proximity fuse shells. 50,000 in 7 days. That's over 7,000 per day. The logistics alone are staggering. Each shell has to be transported from depots, distributed to gun positions, loaded, aimed, and fired. And this is happening in terrible winter weather, over damaged roads, under constant threat of German counterattack. But American logistics are up to the challenge, because this is what American industrial power looks like when fully mobilized. The results are decisive. German resistance breaks, not retreats in good order. Breaks, units dissolve, soldiers surrender en masse, the corridor to Bastogne opens, the siege is lifted. End quote. Funny fuse, that's what American soldiers call them, because there's something almost comical about a shell that knows when to explode by itself. Like the shell is intelligent, like it's making decisions. The Germans don't find them funny at all. They call them Hexen munition, Witch ammunition, because surely only witchcraft could create a weapon this devastating. While Patton drives north, another critical battle is unfolding on Elsenborn Ridge, and it's going to provide the most definitive proof of proximity fuse effectiveness in defensive warfare. Numbers that will be studied in artillery schools for generations. Elsenborn Ridge, high ground dominating the northern shoulder of the German penetration. If it falls, the entire Allied position collapses. Defending it are the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions. Attacking are the elite of the Waffen-SS, the 6th SS Panzer Army, including the 1st S Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. These aren't ordinary soldiers. These are Hitler's Praetorian Guard, fanatical, experienced, equipped with the best weapons Germany can still field. They've been promised that this attack will break through, that they'll drive to Antwerp, that they'll split the Allied armies and turn the tide of the war. They believe it. They believe in their Führer. They believe in their cause, and they're about to discover that belief means nothing against American technology. December 17th. The SS attacks up the steep forested slopes of Elsenborn Ridge in waves. American artillery opens fire, and the killing begins on a scale that staggers both sides. Over 3 days, December 17th through the 19th, American artillery fires 160,000 rounds. 160,000. But here's the key statistic. Only 40,000 of those rounds, 25%, are proximity fused. Yet those 40,000 rounds account for an estimated 60% of the 5,000-plus German casualties. Let me repeat that. 25% of the shells cause 60% of the casualties. The mathematics are undeniable. Proximity fuses multiply American firepower by a factor of 4. 4 times more effective than conventional ammunition. The Germans attack repeatedly. Companies become platoons, platoons become squads, squads become scattered survivors stumbling through the forest. Bodies pile so thick that subsequent waves have to climb over their own dead, and still they come. Because SS troops don't retreat, they're told to fight until victory or death. So they fight, and they die. By December 19th, after 3 days of this slaughter, the attacks cease. The elite of the Waffen-SS, the troops who were supposed to be unstoppable, have been broken by American artillery. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the unit that had fought at Kharkov and Kursk, that had participated in war crimes across the Eastern Front, that represented the pinnacle of Nazi military power, ceases to exist as an effective fighting force. Not because they ran out of courage, not because they were outfought by infantry, but because American science had made their courage irrelevant. Now, while ground combat rages, the Luftwaffe is about to make one final, desperate attempt to regain air superiority, and they're about to discover that proximity fuses work just as well against aircraft as they do against soldiers. Maybe better. January 1st, 1945, Operation Bodenplatte. The Luftwaffe launches 900 fighters in a massive surprise attack against Allied airfields. The surprise is complete. Allied aircraft are caught on the ground, hangars are strafed, fuel dumps explode, ammunition stores detonate. It's the most successful German air operation since 1940. German pilots are exhilarated. Finally, they think, finally, we're hitting back. Finally, we're showing these Americans and British that the Luftwaffe still has teeth. Then they turn for home, and they fly directly into walls of proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. The kill rate is extraordinary. Of 277 German aircraft lost that day, 172 fall to anti-aircraft guns, over 60%. Most of those are destroyed by proximity fuse shells, because proximity fuses transform anti-aircraft gunnery from an art into a science. Before proximity fuses, shooting down an aircraft required incredible skill. You had to predict where the plane would be when your shell arrived. Lead the target, account for wind, account for altitude changes, hope you got lucky. The hit rate for conventional anti-aircraft fire was maybe 2 or 3%. With proximity fuses, you just had to get close. The shell's radar would detect the aircraft and detonate at the optimal distance automatically. The hit rate jumped to 30, 40, sometimes 50%. German pilots trained to evade predictive anti-aircraft fire found shells detonating precisely where they would cause maximum damage. There was no evasion technique, no defensive maneuver. You either got lucky and the shell missed by enough that the fragments didn't hit you, or you died. That day, January 1st, 1945, most German pilots didn't get lucky. The Luftwaffe, already crippled by fuel shortages and lack of replacement aircraft, never recovered from the losses of Operation Bodenplatte. Germany's air force effectively ceased to exist as a strategic force, and proximity fuses were a major factor in that destruction. By early January 1945, maintaining secrecy about proximity fuses becomes impossible. Too many have been fired. Too many soldiers on both sides have witnessed their effects. On January 6th, the War Department authorizes limited disclosure. The New York Times publishes an article describing, quote, a new type of artillery shell that multiplies the effectiveness of American guns, end quote, without explaining the actual technology. German intelligence finally grasps the weapon's significance, but it's far too late. A January 10th report from Foreign Armies West, the German intelligence organization, states, quote, the Americans possess a radio-controlled artillery fuse that detonates shells at optimal height for anti-personnel effect. This weapon has caused severe casualties among our forces in the Ardennes. End quote. No effective countermeasures exist. That admission, buried in a routine intelligence report, tells you everything you need to know about the impact of proximity fuses. Germany's best military minds have examined the problem and concluded there's nothing they can do. They can't jam the fuses because they operate on variable frequencies. They can't armor against them because the fragments come from above. They can't take cover because the fuses find the optimal detonation point automatically. All they can do is die. And that's exactly what they're doing, by the thousands. The Battle of the Bulge ends on January 25, 1945. German forces retreat in disorder, having achieved nothing except the deaths of 100,000 of their own soldiers. American losses total 75,000, including 19,000 killed. It's the largest and bloodiest battle Americans fight in World War II. But it could have been so much worse. Without proximity fuses, how many more Americans would have died? How much longer would the battle have lasted? How many more days would the war have continued? Because every day the war continues, thousands die in combat. Thousands more die in concentration camps. The Holocaust machine keeps running. Every day matters. And proximity fuses shortened the Battle of the Bulge by days, possibly weeks. Post-war interrogations of German commanders provide the clearest assessment of proximity fuse impact. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, overall commander of the German offensive, stated, quote, the proximity fuse was decisive, end quote. Artillery that seemed to have eyes. From the German perspective, that's exactly what it was. Shells that could see, that could decide when to explode. That possessed an almost supernatural ability to find and kill German soldiers wherever they tried to hide. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, testified, quote, the American artillery was the terror of our soldiers, especially the new shells that exploded in the air. End quote. Panic among veterans. Think about what that means. These are men who'd survived years of combat on the Eastern Front, where casualties were measured in millions. They'd faced Soviet artillery barrages that lasted for days. They'd fought through Stalingrad and Kursk and survived. But American proximity fuses broke them, made them panic, made veteran soldiers flee like raw recruits. That tells you everything about the weapon's psychological impact. The statistics tell the final story. 200,000 proximity fuse shells fired during the Battle of the Bulge, an estimated 15 to 20,000 German casualties directly attributable to these shells. That's up to 20% of total German losses caused by a weapon that represented only a small fraction of total American artillery ammunition. Each proximity fuse shell achieved 5 to 10 times greater effectiveness than conventional ammunition while requiring no forward observation in poor weather. But behind every statistic lies human tragedy. German soldiers, many of them teenage conscripts in the war's final stages, died in ways that traditional warfare had never contemplated. They were killed by weapons that seemed to possess intelligence, that could find them wherever they hid. That transformed the very air into a killing zone. American production workers paid their own price. Factory accidents at Crosley Corporation, Emerson Radio, and other facilities were hushed up for security. Workers suffered breakdowns from the stress of 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, for years on end. They produced weapons of unprecedented lethality without knowing what they were making, carrying that burden in enforced silence. Yet the moral calculation of war is never simple. The Battle of the Bulge cost 19,000 American lives. Without proximity fuses, how many more would have died? 30,000? 50,000? How much longer would the war have lasted? Another month? 6 months? How many more Holocaust victims would have perished while battles raged? How many more civilians would have died? Every day, the war shortened, potentially saved thousands. The proximity fuse program generated advances that transformed post-war technology in ways its creators never imagined. The miniaturized vacuum tubes developed by Dr. James Van Allen became foundations for modern electronics. The quality control procedures established for fuse production became industry standards. The organizational methods coordinating hundreds of suppliers pioneered modern supply chain management. Dr. Van Allen himself applied his miniaturization expertise to satellite instrumentation, later discovering Earth's radiation belts that now bear his name. The radar principles evolved into modern systems that guide everything from airliners to missiles. And the concept of autonomous sensors making split-second decisions? That became the foundation for every smart weapon that followed. Every precision-guided munition today, from Tomahawk missiles to JDAM bombs to drone strikes, descends from the proximity fuse. The first weapon that could sense its environment and choose when to detonate. The revolution begun in the Ardennes continues on modern battlefields where smart weapons dominate warfare. General Eisenhower made a chilling assessment after the war. He stated that if Germany had possessed proximity fuses during the D-Day landings, the invasion might have been exceedingly difficult, perhaps impossible. Think about that. The entire liberation of Europe potentially stopped cold by a single weapon system. The proximity fuse wasn't just an improvement to artillery. It was a war-winning technology that fundamentally changed warfare's mathematics. And the most remarkable thing? The German soldiers who faced proximity-fused artillery in December 1944 experienced something that modern soldiers take for granted. Death delivered by weapons that seem intelligent, that can find you anywhere, that make traditional defensive tactics obsolete. They were the first casualties of truly technological warfare. But they weren't the last. The story of the proximity fuse is ultimately about transformation, technological, tactical, human. It proved that industrial democracy could produce weapons of devastating effectiveness, that innovation could overcome numerical disadvantage, that the side with superior science would likely prevail. These lessons shaped not just World War II's remainder, but the entire structure of warfare that followed. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, during those desperate weeks in December 1944 and January 1945, the age of technological warfare truly arrived. The mathematics of death were rewritten by tiny radar sets in artillery shells, and warfare would never be the same again. From Colonel Axelson's unauthorized first use on December 16th, through the systematic deployment of 200,000 shells across the Ardennes, proximity fuses demonstrated that scientific innovation could provide decisive military advantage. American industrial capacity, scientific genius, and tactical adaptation converged to create a weapon that helped determine the war's outcome. The German soldiers who died beneath proximity-fused airbursts weren't just casualties of a particular battle. They were casualties of a revolution in military affairs that continues shaping our world today. A revolution where technology became more important than courage, where science trumped experience, where the nation that could innovate fastest would likely win. That revolution began in earnest in the Ardennes in December 1944, and it's still continuing. Every drone strike, every precision munition, every smart weapon, they all trace their lineage back to those shells exploding 30 feet above the frozen forests of Belgium. Back to German soldiers who died wondering how the Americans had taught shells to think. Back to a moment when warfare transformed forever. The proximity fuse, the secret weapon that won the Battle of the Bulge and changed war itself.